Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the biggest mistakes that I see people making in the cybersecurity field. And I put IBM in parentheses there because obviously we're going to talk partially about that particular platform, but a lot of the discussion is going to be applicable regardless of the technology in use. These are general concepts that really, I think, apply to any platform, any operating system that you might be leveraging in your data center. My name is Tatum. I'm the Director of Security Technologies here at Help Systems, and that gives me the pleasure and honor of being able to speak with our customer base and the IBM community at large with regards to securing the IBM platform. I'm also one of the SMEs for Common, so I also have the pleasure of being able to present sessions at various events around the globe, and sharing that information is, I think, really an important part of people gaining knowledge about how to secure the environment, what risks might be in play when it comes to the IBM platform, and ensuring that you are as well armed as possible when it comes to threat resistance. Now, there are some mistakes that people make. Let's talk about those here. The first one I'm going to touch on is one of denial. Now, you've probably experienced this where you've heard that the IBM platform is secure, and certainly we recognize that that is a fantastic benefit of the IBM platform, along with many other groundbreaking features of the operating system and hardware. But ultimately, we have to recognize that as a technology, there is always some level of risk. But if we deal with the fact that our management teams or our employees or our partners or our vendors are in some mindset that we are not at risk, that this will never happen to us, then we run the risk, of course, of under-deploying or completely non-deployment of the adequate controls. Reality is that data breaches now are up in the 1 in 4 realm, right? So this is a very good likelihood that something is going to happen, but if we're not allocating the appropriate resources to defend against that type of frequent of an attack, then we really are going to be missing the boat when it comes to securing our world. Part of this actually stems from a behavior we call breach fatigue. Now, part of that, unfortunately, stems from the fact that if we look at the risk of a data breach as being so high that it is really inevitable, then there's potential that people are going to want to reallocate funds and resources to the appropriate act of dealing with the aftermath of a data breach rather than trying to defend against it in the first place. Now, I liken that to basic security controls that might exist on your car. You've got locks on the doors, you've got windows, you've got a key system for starting the ignition. And while those things can all be circumvented at some level by somebody who is sufficiently motivated, we also recognize that if we're in a parking lot and we're next to vehicles that have their windows open or their doors unlocked or the keys in the ignition, that the criminals tend to gravitate towards those items that are easiest to exploit. And if we find an organization that has no firewall and their system is on the internet in other types of grandiose mistakes, there's a very good likelihood that the vultures are going to zero in on those systems more so than they are in ones that have deployed adequate controls as best they could. So important that we fight this idea of breach fatigue. It's important that we recognize that this definitely could happen to us and that it is necessary to implement the appropriate controls on any technology to ensure that we are defended as best we possibly can against any type of risk or threat. From an IBM context, certainly many of us have heard over the years that this platform is extremely secure. In fact, when you go to the IBM website and you look at the power systems area of that site, you'll see a disclosure or a disclaimer that IBM is considered one of the most secure systems in the industry. Now, if you've been around IBM at all, you'll know that anytime something is put in print like that, it's gone through an entire army of attorneys and legal departments in order to verify that there is no exposure that could come back on IBM for that. But this is interesting. Although the verbiage may change over time, this general consistency in the idea that this system is secure is something that we have seen for many years. And again, it's something that we leverage when we talk about the value statement of IBMI and the hardware on which it runs. But I would offer up that this statement is actually slightly misleading. It suggests that the system is inherently secure, meaning that we didn't have to actually do anything to get it into that state. And the reality is that I really recognize that this system is highly securable rather than being inherently secure. And if you're a visual person, hopefully this image here will give you an idea of the fact that there are security controls. There is the ability to ensure this system is extremely secure, but those controls don't necessarily come pre-configured by default. It is up to us to twist that lock and push it down. Now, in IBMI, that means leveraging all of the controls that have been given to us in the operating system, as well as potentially evaluating whether there are outside tools that would increase the functionality that we have at our fingertips. Now, the reason I know it's securable rather than secure is the fact that one of my responsibilities here at Health Systems is to publish our annual State of IBMI Security Study. In fact, I'm going to be gearing up here in the next few weeks to start analyzing the data for the 2019 study. But this is not a new report. It's been published now since 2004, and it really has given us a unique insight into how most IBMI servers are configured, the controls that have been used, and as importantly, which controls have not been used. Over the years, we've looked at thousands of different systems in various roles in different industries of different organizational sizes. But there is definitely a theme here in that we are seeing a general underdeployment of the facilities that we've been given access to. If you've never read this study, certainly I invite you to go out to our Health Systems website, download this copy. And while the 2019 study should be rolling off the presses in the first quarter of 2019, I will encourage you to take a look even at the 2018 study, because I will admit there is a consistency here of things that people tend to leave exposed on the platform, and I would like you to have that information sooner rather than later. This denial is something that really has to be overcome at a management level. Once we recognize that there is risk and we convey that to our management decision makers, we have the potential then that we can allocate resources in order to remediate it. If we are at an IT level not sharing that news, basically because perhaps we know that there won't be funds allocated, or we're fearful that we're going to be the ones blamed for the lack of security, we have to recognize that our management team can't make good business decisions if they're not provided with all of the business information. I typically don't see anybody finger pointing when it comes to the discovery of weak security unless that has been breached. So you are in a much stronger position to bring that to the attention of your management team proactively as part of either a security assessment or a remediation project than you are in the aftermath of a data breach. All right, I also want to talk to you a little bit about reliance. And what I mean by this is reliance on one or two different access controls that we think are going to be impenetrable and going to provide the necessary restrictions to access to our systems. Many times we talk about the fact that there is a firewall in place. This is a perimeter control around the organization that filters the in and outbound traffic to ensure that it is coming from a known source, that it is only allowing access to the approved services within the organization, and it is an incredibly important layer of control. The problem is when we start to think of that as being the only necessary control, or the fact that this control is impenetrable, because ultimately anybody who is sufficiently skilled and motivated is most likely going to be able to somehow get their way through that layer. If we assume that that is never possible, then we're overlooking the fact that not only is it possible, as we see in many of the large data breaches, but at some level we're not acknowledging the fact that not all threats come from outside the organization. I'll talk more about that as we get into the content here, but certainly the firewall is a critically important piece of security infrastructure, but to rely on that as our sole control is probably a little short-sighted and is naive to think that somebody will not be able to get through. Kind of like closing the windows on your car but leaving the keys in the ignition. Doesn't take a whole lot to put a brick through the window, and once you're inside, it's easy then to take the car. What we want to do instead is apply these controls in a more layered approach. We want to ensure that if somebody does penetrate the initial layer, that they're presented with additional challenges. The skill here is making this as transparent as possible to the legitimate users. We're not looking to make their life more difficult. We're not looking to maximize the invasion into their day-to-day activities. What we're trying to do is be a little more subtle. We're placing these controls here that we're either limiting access to services that are appropriate to the user's tasks, we're monitoring for these connections and how they're being used, and then, of course, we're making sure that we have something to bring anomalies to our attention. The bottom line is most users don't need access to every server. They don't need access to every application. And if we simply say, hey, you've got a user ID that gets you on the network, once somebody gets there, what we have is what we call the M&M defense. It's got a hard shell on the perimeter, but once you get inside, it's soft, gooey chocolate deliciousness. And from a hacker's perspective, to be able to get inside that perimeter really should not provide them with unfettered access to the rest of the network. In an IBMI context, what we tend to do is look at what we call legacy security controls. We see our users signing onto the system and leveraging perhaps a green screen application, still heavily relied on even in today's technology market. If the user signs in and they see a menu, it's very easy to understand that they can only take the options that are being presented to them. But if the user discovers that there are indeed other ways to access the database, then all of a sudden we have exposure to the fact that the behind-the-scenes security controls have never been deployed. A great example of this is users who are operating with all object special authority. This, in essence, is the keys to the database kingdom. If we can gain access to a file, we can do anything to that file, including reading, changing, and even deleting the data. If I am assuming that the user is only coming through a green screen emulation session, then I'm missing the fact that there are other database access methods. ODBC, FTP, DDM. These interfaces all allow the user to connect directly to the database. They're not passing through a menuing system. They're not even passing through controls that might be built into the application itself because we're going straight to the database. If we relied purely on menus, yes, that would restrict, arguably, the legitimate users and corral them into their legitimate functions. But anybody who is coming in to the server without permission most likely is coming in through other mechanisms. I always liken this to the fact that a hacker is unlikely to penetrate your perimeter network and then go download a copy of iSeries or IBM Access Client Solutions and load up an emulator and try and hack you through the green screen. More likely, they're going to use SQL injection attacks, brute force attacks. They're going to try and get in through protocols that are standard on every system platform, not things that are unique to IBMI. And in fact, then what we've done is really given ourselves a false sense of security because we feel like our green screen security is rock solid based on menus and command line restrictions and other legacy controls, only to find that the risk is coming from a completely different attack vector. Unfortunately, if we go in with that single layer mindset, we're going to ultimately end up with some broken eggs. We're going to find that data has been pulled into an Excel spreadsheet and placed on a C drive on a laptop. It's put on a network drive. It's posted on a website inadvertently. And because we didn't have additional controls, whether they be access controls or audit visibility, we're really not ensuring the protection of the core asset. We're simply limiting one access methodology. As such, I encourage you to take advantage of those legacy controls, but recognize that they are not 100% effective and ensure that we are acknowledging that many different access methods may be available to our users or our unauthorized entry people, and we want to make sure that we're monitoring and controlling all of those access methods in addition to the traditional ones. Currency is a reference in my vernacular to ensuring that everything that we're using is kept as up to date as is reasonably possible. There are many aspects to IT that we need to keep as current as we can. That can range from the hardware itself to the operating systems to the applications that we deploy for our business users. If we find that these are outdated, then there is an increased risk that somebody is going to find a weakness or a vulnerability that they can take advantage of. Again, this is not unique to IBMI. In fact, a lot of what we saw in 2017 pertaining to ransomware was a susceptibility in older versions and unpatched versions of Microsoft Windows. Now, as much as we may look at Windows as being the threat within our IT infrastructure for many of us, we have to acknowledge that if we're not patching, if we're not maintaining currency of the operating system, we have exposure regardless of the manufacturer of that platform. In the case of Windows, we want to certainly make sure that we're applying patches, but do many of us do that in an IBMI world? Sure, we put PTFs on perhaps as a cumulative update once every 6 months, maybe once a year, sometimes maybe only right before we do an OS upgrade. But this is something that we need to stay on top of. Granted, the patches perhaps are less security oriented on IBMI than they are on other platforms, but if you think about it in its base form, if we're running on an unsupported version of the operating system, or we are far distant in our most recent application of PTFs, any discovered flaw that may have surfaced and has potentially been resolved a long time ago is going to be still a vulnerability to us. So we want to make sure that we define a good policy around ensuring that our systems are kept up to date. We don't want to call IBM and say, hey, look, our system is having an issue. We feel that there is a vulnerability here. And oh, by the way, we're on version 5, release 4, even version 7, release 1, which are unsupported versions of the operating system. Granted, IBM will extend support contracts if you pay for it, and many of you may take advantage of that. Certainly, if you're at the end of life of your hardware and there is no easy way to upgrade the operating system beyond an unsupported release, then this is potentially an option, but it's an expensive way to go and certainly is not a good utilization of budget dollars unless this really is the last platform server you're going to be using. It's much better to plan for that obsolescence over time. And to be fair to IBM, the lifespan of both the hardware and the operating system is pretty long. Most OS releases come out about every 2, maybe 3 years, but the support for those OSs tends to last 7 or 8 years. We just went off support of version 7.1. That was released in early 2010 and support didn't end until the mid-2018 period. So a very extended period of life, and it's really up to us to make sure that we're planning for that. Bear in mind that there is most likely going to be a new release of IBMI coming out in the 2019 timeframe. And if that's the case, then we have to acknowledge that there is most likely going to be the indication of end of life on a prior OS, which is currently version 7.2. We know from the State of IBMI Security study that we have a lot of systems still on 7.1 and 7.2. So as we migrate these things, we want to be looking forward. I would not be going to version 7.2 at this point, even though it is supported, because we know that that is a ticking clock. Unless you, again, have a hardware restriction that limits you to 7.2 on that particular technology, I'd be looking to 7.3 or potentially waiting until 7.4 comes out. But 7.3 still has a lot of life left in it. Another mistake people make is in determining the origin of where their risk may come from. We certainly understand that on the Hollywood movies, a lot of times it's somebody hacking in from the outside. They're coming from another country, they're coming from a competitive industry, and they're breaking their way in through some clever technique. The reality is, though, that we have to acknowledge that not all threat comes from outside the firewall. I talked about what a critical infrastructure that is, and the reason is that we still see the majority of data breaches originating from a hack type activity. But there is also the risk of somebody from inside the organization, be it an employee, an ex-employee, a contractor, a business partner, actually instigating the breach. Now, it's not hard to believe that, because if you think about it, if we think of the perimeter firewall as being our most stringent control, this community has already been given access to that. In other words, they've been given the keys to the car, and at this point, we're just hoping that they don't do anything to damage that particular environment. There's numerous cases of internal mismanagement of data. This kind of falls into several subcategories. It may be malicious, of course. There are always people that are trying to profit or benefit from things that they're given access to. There was a pretty high-profile case at Columbia Sportswear where a senior employee of the IT department, he'd been there for more than a decade, had resigned to go work for a company that was selling product to Columbia. And before he resigned, he actually created an alternate set of credentials. So even though Columbia went through and did their normal due diligence of disabling this employee's account, he was leaving on good standing. They had no reason to believe that there was anything else nefarious going on. But after he had left, he was using that entry point to get into the email systems of his ex-company and getting information about contracts that were potentially coming through. He discovered that there was a potential relationship that was going to happen with a company called Pure, and his new organization had no relationship with that company. So they went out and formed a partnership, and that way they had the inside track on being able to potentially sell a significant amount of value to Columbia. Now, he was caught. His new employer denied any knowledge of that as being something he was doing, but he was leveraging creatively access back into the system. There's many other examples, perhaps not quite as high profile. Unfortunately, we don't hear of a lot of these because when there is an inside breach, depending on whether there is a requirement for disclosure, many times they are not announced. The employee is perhaps terminated, the access is closed down, and we just kind of bury our head in the sand. Let's face it, it's an embarrassing thing when somebody that you have granted access to takes advantage of that. We also have to acknowledge that there's accidents that happen. People delete things that they shouldn't. They rename things, they copy things, they overlay things. Anytime there is human interaction with an IT system, there's possibility that somebody is going to mess up. I know in my IT career, I've pressed enter on more than one occasion and really wish that the keyboard had asked me if I was sure that I really wanted to do what I was asking it to do. This is a much more common environment, but it's no less challenging to the organization because it still may involve role swapping or doing a recovery from media in order to regain access to that damaged information or application. So we have to recognize all of this is a potential threat. PrivacyRights.org is a not-for-profit organization that tracks data breaches that are due to insiders as well as outsiders. And in looking at that database a couple days ago, that tally has climbed all the way up to 83 million records that can be that were attributed as being breached due to somebody inside the organization. Again, perhaps an employee or a contractor or somebody who had actually been given access legitimately to the environment. So recognizing that risk is a big part of being able to defend against it and deploy the appropriate layered controls as we discussed earlier. Preparation is one of the most important aspects to anything in life. If there is an expectation that something could happen and it could cause disruption, then we need to be prepared for that eventuality. If it's a low likelihood, perhaps we don't put as much emphasis on the preparation as something that perhaps is highly likely, or that if it were to happen would be catastrophic. When it comes to cybersecurity, we now know that there is a high likelihood that we're going to be attacked, and in fact, that we could indeed be breached. But how many of us actually have considered that fact and have a defined plan of how we're going to respond? If we look at this in purely recovery terms, if we look at the standard disaster recovery conversation, I think many of us have deployed good controls and have prepared them. We recognize that our data center could lose power. There could be a fire or a flood or some form of natural disaster that may prevent us from utilizing our primary business applications on the main server. We set up data centers in alternate locations or have secondary systems that are constantly mirroring themselves to the production so that we have the ability to switch over if there is a hardware outage or some type of business resiliency interruption. We usually have run books that tell us how to do this. If there is a defined or declared disaster, what are we going to do? Who do we call? Who do we bring in? What hardware do we bring online? We test this typically annually, maybe semi-annually. We're going to go out. We're going to take our tapes and restore them somewhere. We're going to do a planned outage and do a role swap to make sure that everything comes over and the applications work perfectly. But how many of us have done that same planning for the idea of a data corruption event or a data breach? How do we recognize that that's occurring, and do we know who to call? We take calls here at Help Systems from people that are suspicious or that have determined that there was some type of unauthorized access attempt. Unfortunately, oftentimes they're calling us because they know us from conversations they've had in the past. And at the time they call us, they haven't even disconnected the systems. They don't know whether they should or not. They don't know whether they should call law enforcement, and if so, which branch should they cover. The local PD is probably not going to be a lot of use, but many people don't realize that the FBI, the Secret Service, has people that specialize in investigating this type of criminal activity. So having that defined carefully ahead of time, even if it's not fully tested, is an important step in the right direction. We want to acknowledge that perhaps there are people that should be in charge of this, people that are knowledgeable, that have contacts in the industry to know who should be brought in and who should be notified and when. If you don't do that, I liken it to the idea that we're coming up with a disaster recovery plan after or during the data center being on fire under 3 foot of water. Not ideal to be creating that on the fly. Much better to have it ahead of time, even if we have to make some tweaks as we go along. There's at least a defined plan of what we should be doing. This is really quite a simple process in its overall state, which is the idea that we have this cyclical type of analysis. First of all, we're going to prepare for some type of possible event, and we have to discuss internally what we see those events might be. Of course, there are experts that we can bring in that can give us assistance in that regard. There's lessons, endless lessons that we can learn from other people with regards to the types of attacks and events that could transpire. If we've prepared, though, we also have to understand that in order for us to know if some type of activity is happening, we have to have the necessary controls in place to detect it and to analyze those activities to determine if there is indeed some type of event we need to respond to. If there is, we have to have a plan on how to contain it, how to recover from it if it has indeed already progressed far enough. Then we go back and we do additional detection until we are comfortable that we have determined the full scope of the breach. It's so common for people to release news. Experian was a good example where they had experienced the data breach and then came back later on, provided additional numbers of even more millions of people whose names and social security numbers had been exposed. Equifax. After that, we have to recognize that there needs to be post-incident activity. We're going to have to do some triage as it pertains to perhaps legal exposure or customer satisfaction or remediating the activities on a long-term state, and then going back to preparation with now a better insight into what could go wrong. If we don't have this type of plan in place, what tends to happen is the lack of preparedness means that if something happens, we're not confident that we know how to deal with it. And the human nature reaction to that is that we panic. We don't have a defined strategy, and so we run around with our chickens with our heads cut off, not knowing who to call or what to do. And perhaps we're not containing the problem, and it's just getting worse and worse. And we may be throwing gasoline on that fire by doing the things that we're doing, even though we're doing them with the best intentions in mind. So having an incident response plan is very important. Not having one is arguably one of the biggest mistakes we see. Lack of preparedness is, of course, the underlying factor there. Now, here's a long word, underutilization. What I mean by this is the fact that in many instances, we have access to facilities and tooling that would help us in the journey to being secure, and that we are either not using or underutilizing those techniques, those controls, in order to ensure that we have the best chances possible of being able to defend against some form of attack. Now, as a reminder, in the IBMI context, this is where we stand. We are securable, not inherently secure. So that means that there is work for us to do in order to transition from the open padlock to the closed padlock. We have a lot of tools in IBMI ranging from DB2 and object level security that goes all the way down to the record and field level. We have disk encryption. We have field procedures that allow record and field level encryption. We have menu security, command line security. We have access to exit programs. We have system values. All of these things are going to come together to give us the ability to prevent somebody from accessing data that they don't have a proven business requirement to access. If we don't utilize those tools, then we're really going to find that we are susceptible to somebody basically doing whatever they want. And I can't really overstate this enough. The number of systems that I look at on literally a daily basis, whereby I can take a profile that is appropriate to an end user and FTP a file directly off of that system onto my thumb drive or email attachment, is mind-blowing. Okay? And so we want to make sure that we're closing those loopholes. They're all relatively easy to close if you are utilizing the tools that you have at your disposal. Again, the State of IBMI Security talks to this. I encourage you yet again to download that report, to do some research, do some Googling or your search engine of choice to find out what are the configuration errors that we see so that we can take advantage of the tools that we have been provided. Ultimately, inaction, or the fact that we just simply do nothing, is arguably the even greater mistake than not leveraging the tools. So once we know that there are vulnerabilities, once we know that we have these tools available to us as part of IBMI or other operating systems, and the fact that we're not using them, we don't actually then take action to resolve those issues, is of course a real criminal mistake, I think, for anybody who has that expertise. The worst plan for anything in cybersecurity is to do nothing, not responding to the risks, not looking into whether there are risks because we want to bury our head in the sand, is a dangerous way to behave. Even if you're not entirely sure where to start, what we want to do is take action. For us on the IBMI platform, we've been around the box, many of us, for years and years, and we're still reliant on the techniques that we used many decades ago. We know that this is not going to be cleaned up and resolved by lunchtime tomorrow. It's going to take some time, and we tend to end up with this deer in the headlights look of, well, I'm not going to do anything because I either deny the risk, I don't know what tools are available, I'm not sure how to use them, I don't have a plan for being prepared that would mandate that I have to. Maybe I don't even have a regulatory mandate that says that I have to do this, and certainly I'm not going to spend money or deflect my IT projects if I don't have to. and I tend to just get this deer in the headlights look. You're much better off defining even simple acts that you can do that will provide either a slowing of the mistakes or a reversal of the mistakes. Copying profiles, changing system values, these are all things that tend to lead to problems because when we migrate from one technology to a newer technology, we tend to bring it over on media. When we put in that shiny new Power 9 server, we're probably not going to key all our user information back in. We're simply going to save it off the Power 8 and restore it on the Power 9. And we did that with the previous generation and the one before that and the one before that. And we quickly discovered that most of the profiles that are operating on our system can be traced back clear to early versions of the OS, even back to AS400 days. If we don't stop that same process, at some point, we're just going to propagate it to the Power 10 or whatever the next evolution will be. So the first act for me is to evaluate where you're at so that you know where the risks are, and then you can set a gradual game plan for how you're going to remediate those things. Again, it's not all going to be done by tomorrow, but that doesn't mean you can't have some conversation and start thinking about what needs to be done in order to improve the current stance. So here we have it. All of the biggest mistakes that I see being made in security. We've got denial, of course, that we don't recognize that there is risk that could happen to us, not just everybody else out there. We've got reliance on individual technologies that we perceive as being bulletproof, but if circumvented or broken somehow, suddenly provides open access to all of our assets. We have a challenge of staying current on our hardware, our software, our OSs and our applications, and making sure that we're patching those on a timely basis. We have recognition that not all hacks come from outside. Certainly, many of them do. We've got phishing techniques that are becoming increasingly, not less frequently, successful, which is always surprising, but criminals are very intelligent. They're very creative in many instances, and while early exploits may be laughable when we're offered millions of dollars from an African prince, when you look at the phishing attacks that happen now that come from purportedly Amazon and other services that look extremely legitimate, it's not hard to believe that our users are going to fall for that. In fact, the click-through rate and open rate for emails in 2016 was quite staggering. It was up around 16%, which is quite impressive. We're not often prepared for the eventuality that there could be some form of data breach event, be it accidental or be it malicious. And if we don't have a game plan, then we're going to scramble and we're going to make mistakes. We're not utilizing the tools that we've been given access to. We're very spoiled in the IBM community that we have so much security infrastructure built right into the OS, but it is shocking how many people just simply don't use it. And ultimately, learning these things and doing nothing about it is going to be the final mistake that you make, because even though you know these things happen or could be happening, we're not doing anything to resolve it. So I know you guys are here. You've invested your time this morning to talk about or learn about the things that are mistakes. And so I'm going to give you a call to action that allows you to actually deflect at least one of these, which is inaction. And what I'm going to offer to you is the idea that we are making available a security scan. It looks just like this, as you see on the screen here, and it's done at no cost to you. It's something that can happen in under a minute. It provides a printed report that you can keep. We'll even include some expert review with you. We'll spend about an hour with you on an online meeting and go through the findings, explain exactly what they mean, answer any questions that you may have about your environment, and all of that is done at no cost and no obligation. All right, so I want you to take advantage of that. Now, I'm going to share with you a poll that I'd like to do here. I'm curious as to your own interpretation as the concerns or mistakes that you feel are being made. So let me open that now. Maybe you can just give me a little bit of feedback about where you see the mistakes and what you're most concerned about. We'll give you just a few minutes to open or to answer that. And as you're doing so, if you want to think about what questions you have, I'm going to take those through the Q&A panel. Feel free to send those through. and I'll be happy to do my best to answer those. We got a few minutes here until we're done, so I'll hang out until we get those answered. Just to give you a progress report here, looks like the winner at this point, or the leader, is the idea of giving users too much access to data. And I think that is definitely a legitimate concern. We see on average 150 users on every system running with the all object special authority that I mentioned. This is the keys to the kingdom. You can do virtually anything with all object special authority, including gaining the other 7 special authorities by running a job as somebody else. So definitely an area that I think, again, stems back to part of the legacy of the system, the migration of the profiles. Second is then not detecting an attack until after the data has potentially been compromised. Again, IBMI has auditing built in, but we still see a significant portion of customers that are either not even activating that facility, or that have activated it and don't look at the data, or don't do anything with it, or they don't keep it long enough. Some people turn it on as part of their HA application deployment. They purge the data the next day because it's no longer needed for HA, and they've obviously lost visibility to it. So very good feedback. I appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and close that poll now, and thank you for that feedback. All right, here's a resource for you as well. Helpsystems.com gives you access to product information. Of course, we do sell a comprehensive suite of security tools and solutions. We also have an expansive set of service offerings ranging from risk assessments to pen testing to security remediation work, as well as managed security services if you don't necessarily want to take this journey all by yourself. We're there by your side. Take advantage of that for security monitoring, for single sign-on, and other things. Definitely a valuable aspect to our offerings. We also have a number of technical articles and guides that are around IBMI security itself. We are a big believer in IBMI providing a solid foundation on which we build from. So we are not just about software and services. We're also about the operating system and ensuring that you have that good foundation deployed underneath anything else that you do. If you're interested in a free security scan, you can sign up for that on helpsystems.com as well. I'm also going to open up just a secondary poll here very quickly. If you are interested in getting one of those security scans, again, this is something that is done at no charge, and we can do that for you very easily, provide you with access to the software. You download it, you run it on a PC. It can be run in the middle of the day. If you'd like more information on that, just let us know. I'll be happy to get you that. I know sometimes people are a little gun shy about allowing some type of scan to run, and we want you to be better in security, not compromise you in any way. So I'm always happy to give some further background than we have time to do here today. So you don't have to necessarily commit one way or another. We'll be happy to do that for you. All right, I'm just going to look at the chat panel here. We're going to see if there's any questions that you have. Again, if you do have a question for me, feel free to shoot it to me through the Q&A here, and I'll be happy to take a look at that. It looks like somebody's asking about so the security scan, does that run on IBMI? Actually, it runs on Windows, and it transfers some code over to IBMI. So it's all self-contained inside your network. We don't need access. The only reason we do the online meeting is so that we can see the results, because obviously if we're going to answer questions, we need to be able to see it. But that is entirely yours to keep. We give a 7-day grace period is really how that works. You can run it against as many partitions as you want for that period of time. So if you make some changes, you can rerun it. If you've got an HA partition, you can target that as well as production. So really, we invite you to take advantage of that. All right. As far as insider breaches, looks like a couple of you were asking about the statistic I gave on the number of records breached. It is actually an organization called privacyrights.org. If you go out to that website, they maintain a chronology of data breaches that involve personal identifying information or sensitive data, and you can cross-reference that. You can look for breaches of a certain type. Where I did insiders in order to get my 83 million statistic, but absolutely you can slice and dice that database and get information. And the thing that's most eye-opening to me is that while we read in the headlines about the mega breaches, in fact, we're seeing the big one about the Starwood holiday chain or hotel chain right now, which could be one of the top 10 data breaches. There are so many more that happen well under the radar because, quite honestly, we've been desensitized in some regard to anything but a record level setting breach. So I don't want you to ever be discouraged or think your management is discouraged from thinking that this isn't a constant type of activity, because it is, and privacyrights.org does a nice job of identifying those, I think, and it's pretty sobering. All right, Godfrey, you're asking, what tool do we use for detecting breaches in an IBM environment? Well, the first thing we have to do is determine that we have to define a breach, right? For me, the user who is accessing the database without your permission is obviously a breach to you, but if they're doing so with the permission of the operating system, meaning they have authority to the objects, the operating system is going to make that very difficult to detect that as quote-unquote a breach. So what I typically do is start by recommending to a customer that first they activate the built-in auditing features of the operating system. There's no charge to this. There's a single command that you run that will activate and configure those auditing controls. Why not do it? There's no performance penalty. There is some disk usage, of course, with the data, depending on how much of it you keep and the types of events that you're logging, but that's usually a pretty minor issue. And the nice thing about the controls is they can be dialed up and they can be dialed down. It's not a commitment to all or nothing. So we want to make sure that that is active. Second of all, we've got to ensure that the security really supports the policy that the company may have. If a user shouldn't have access to application A's data, then let's configure application A that would prevent that, because then we can detect an authority failure when they try to access it. If we don't have that base infrastructure, that doesn't mean we don't have visibility at all. For example, we can audit objects that may be sensitive. We can track to see if somebody is coming through a TCP interface that would not be part of their job. This is arguably one of the most common things we see, where a user is a green screen application user and all of a sudden that profile is using ODBC. And that's not a normal connection. So we want to be able to see that, acknowledge it. That does take some additional software. We would discuss exit programs in that case to be able to audit, as well as potentially reject those connections, right? So maybe, Godfrey, depending on what's in place today already, my answer would vary, but at the end of the day, there are things in the base operating system. There's some easy to deploy functionality through third party that would give you much better visibility to the potential of a data breach than not doing anything. Steve, you're asking, what would you suggest with using the tool Start Authority Collection? So the Authority Collection is a facility that was introduced in version 7, release 3 of the operating system, and it allows us to turn on some visibility, if you will, for how the operating system does its authority checking. So in the past, we had to do some speculation with regards to, we have a user that needs to access objects on the system. We think they maybe need this amount of authority, but we're not entirely sure. So we're going to kind of guess and keep our fingers crossed that we don't break anything. With authority collection, what we're able to do is turn on a function on a profile level, have the user do the application functions as they normally would, and behind the scenes, we're going to build, in essence, a view of how the operating system is looking at their permissions and how the user either gained or was denied access. So we know if it comes from an authorization list, we know if it comes from public or private permissions, how much authority they actually needed to the file. And even if their authority was insufficient, it'll tell us what they would have needed in order to complete that task successfully. So it's a great feature. It's not for the faint of heart. I know we have webinars that have been done here at Help Systems. So go out to helpsystems.com. I mentioned that we are able to provide you with information about the different things within the operating system, and that's a good recorded webinar that I would offer is definitely worth watching. All right. All right, well, that looks like all the questions that I have for right now. I want to thank everybody for joining. Again, if you are interested in running a security scan, I have that information. If you wanted more info, we'll make sure that we reach out and get that to you. Please visit helpsystems.com, download the resources that are available to you, and if there's anything else that we can help you with, then feel free to reach out. Again, this is my contact information. Easiest way to reach me is through email, robin.tatum@helpsystems.com. Otherwise, of course, you can access help through the website, through the chat, or email from there as well. With that, I want to thank everybody for joining. We appreciate that. Hope you are going to have a remainder of the day that is absolutely fantastic. And if you did have any other questions that we didn't have time for, I will reach out to you after the event. Again, thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure.